A mother loses everything simply for bringing two baby girls into the world. But just as her future collapses into the dust, a stranger rides in and changes the course of her life. What he says and what he does will shake an entire town. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. Thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Sarah Thatcher clutched her swollen belly, feeling the first pangs of labor. The small cabin she called home shuddered against the wind, dust filtering through the rough-hewn planks. At 32, Sarah had been widowed just 3 months prior when her husband James was thrown from his horse while herding cattle. Now alone in the world save for the child growing inside her, she gripped the bedpost as another contraction tore through her body. "Lord Almighty," she whispered, her knuckles white. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was 5 miles away, and the nearest doctor even further. Sarah had planned to stay with the midwife in town next week, but the baby or babies as she would soon discover had other plans. As rain began to pelt the roof, a knock came at the door. Sarah stumbled toward it, relief washing over her as she recognized Martha Jenkins, her closest neighbor from 2 miles down the road. "I was just passing by to check on you when the storm hit," Martha said, her eyes widening as she took in Sarah's condition. "My stars, child, you're in labor." "The pain started an hour ago," Sarah managed between breaths. "Getting stronger now." Martha, a mother of 5, immediately took charge. "Let's get you to bed. I've helped birth enough babies to know what to do." Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. When the first baby girl slipped into Martha's waiting hands, Sarah barely had time to process before Martha announced, "There's another one coming." By dawn, Sarah lay exhausted but marveling at the 2 identical baby girls nestled against her chest. "Twins," she whispered, in awe. "James would have been so proud." Martha smiled tiredly. "What will you name them?" Sarah looked down at their tiny faces. "Emma and Elizabeth. Emma for my mother, Elizabeth for James's." As the morning light strengthened, Martha stood by the window. "I should fetch Pastor Williams. These little ones need a proper blessing, and you'll need help, Sarah, a widow with twin girls." She trailed off, concern etching her weathered face. "I'll manage," Sarah said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at her. With James gone, the ranch was too much for her alone, but it was all she had left of him. 3 days later, Pastor Williams arrived with his wife, bringing food and supplies. His visit, however, brought unexpected trouble in the form of Edgar Thorne, James's cousin who had always coveted the Thatcher ranch. "Twins, you say?" Edgar's thin lips curled as he surveyed the cabin. He had arrived uninvited, following the pastor's wagon. Girls, no less. How unfortunate. Sarah, still weak from childbirth, sat straighter in her chair. "My daughters are a blessing, Edgar." "Your daughters," he emphasized mockingly, "will be the ruin of this ranch." "What will you do? Work the fields with babies at your breast? Drive cattle? Mend fences?" He shook his head. "James would have wanted me to take over, for your own good." "James left everything to me," Sarah countered, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Edgar leaned closer. "The bank won't extend your loan come fall. Not to a widow with 2 useless mouths to feed. I'm offering you a way out, Sarah. Sell to me now, while you still have some dignity." Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "That's enough, Edgar. This is hardly the time." But Edgar wasn't finished. "Think on it, Sarah. This land needs a man's touch. Your girls need a future, not a stubborn mother's pride." After he left, the pastor's wife squeezed Sarah's hand. "Don't you mind him. The Lord provides." Yet as weeks passed, Sarah found Edgar's prediction proving true. Few were willing to hire a woman for ranch work, especially one with infant twins. The meager savings James had left dwindled rapidly. When Emma and Elizabeth were 6 weeks old, disaster struck. The bank manager, a friend of Edgar's, arrived with papers demanding immediate payment on a loan Sarah didn't know James had taken. Without funds to pay, she was given 1 month to vacate the property. That night, rocking her daughters to sleep, Sarah wept silently. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to the babies who slumbered peacefully, unaware of their precarious future. Outside, a coyote howled, lonely and persistent against the vast Montana night. Inside, a mother's determination began to harden like steel. The day Sarah Thatcher was forced from her home dawned bright and cruel. July heat shimmered across the plains as Sheriff Thomas Cooper supervised the eviction, his expression a mask of professional detachment that couldn't quite hide his discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thatcher," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "The law's the law." Sarah stood in the yard, twins bundled against her chest in a makeshift sling, watching as 2 men carried out the cradle James had built. Her face remained stoic, though her heart splintered with each piece of furniture removed from the cabin. "Where will you go?" the sheriff asked quietly. "Martha Jenkins offered her spare room until I find work," Sarah replied, her voice steady, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She would not give Edgar Thorne, who watched from atop his horse at the edge of the property, the satisfaction of seeing her break. Edgar dismounted, strolling toward her with the casual confidence of a man who just won a long game. "You could have avoided this, Sarah," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "A sensible woman would have accepted my offer." Sarah clutched her daughters tighter. "A sensible man wouldn't steal from his own family." Edgar's smile faltered. "I didn't steal anything. Business is business." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Those girls were your downfall. No woman can run a ranch, especially not with twin burdens." "My daughters are not burdens," Sarah hissed back. Edgar scoffed, then raised his voice again. "Look at you thrown into the dirt because you were too proud to accept help. What kind of mother puts pride before her children's welfare?" Something in Sarah snapped. Weeks of grief, fear, and exhaustion culminated in a moment of raw fury. "Get away from my daughters." Or, "What?" Edgar sneered. Before Sarah could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Or you'll answer to me." All heads turned to see a man astride a chestnut stallion. Dust coated his long coat, and his face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. But there was no mistaking the authority in his posture. "This is private business, stranger," Edgar said, straightening his vest. "Best move along." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion. Up close, Sarah could see he was tall, with broad shoulders and eyes the color of a winter sky. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and though his clothes were travel-worn, they spoke of quality. "Name's Matthew Reed," he said, his gaze never leaving. "Edgar. And I make it my business when I see a man harassing a woman and her infants. I'm merely collecting what's rightfully mine." Edgar protested. Matthew looked around slowly, taking in the scene, the cabin being emptied, Sarah standing with her babies in the yard, the small crowd of onlookers. "Sheriff," Matthew called, "is this eviction legal?" Sheriff Cooper nodded reluctantly. "Bank foreclosure. Papers are in order." Matthew studied Sarah for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. "Mrs. Thatcher," she supplied. "Sarah Thatcher." "Mrs. Thatcher." He continued, "Do you have somewhere to go?" "Yes," she answered, though Martha's spare room was hardly a solution. Matthew nodded, then turned back to Edgar. "You've got your property. Now back away from the lady and her children." Edgar's face flushed. "Who do you think you are?" "Someone who doesn't like bullies," Matthew replied evenly. "Especially those who'd throw women and babies into the dirt." A tense silence followed, broken only by one of the twins, Elizabeth, starting to fuss. Edgar glanced around at the watching crowd, seemingly aware that public sentiment wasn't in his favor. "Fine," he spat finally. "Take your brats and go." As Edgar stalked away, Matthew turned to Sarah. "May I help you to your friend's home, Mrs. Thatcher?" Pride warred with practicality in Sarah's mind. She had few possessions left: some clothes, the twins' things, a portrait of James, and her mother's silver hairbrush, but even those would be difficult to carry along with 2 infants. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she finally said. "That would be kind." As Matthew loaded her meager belongings onto his horse, Sarah overheard the sheriff speaking to him in low tones. "You're the Reed from Colorado? The one who bought the old Miller place?" "Word travels fast," Matthew replied. "Small town," the sheriff shrugged. "Folks have been wondering who purchased that land. It's been vacant since old Miller passed last." Winter. Sarah felt a flicker of curiosity despite her circumstances. The Miller Ranch bordered what had been her property to the south, a larger spread with better water access that James had always admired. With her possessions secured, Matthew helped Sarah onto his horse before taking the reins and leading them toward Martha's home. "You're safe now," he said quietly as they left the property, his eyes meeting hers briefly. No one should treat a mother that way, especially not for giving birth to daughters. The simple statement, delivered without condescension or pity, brought the first tears Sarah had allowed herself since the bank manager's visit. She quickly blinked them away, unwilling to appear weak. "My girls are a blessing," she said firmly. Edgar never understood that. Matthew glanced back at her. Some men can't see past their own greed. They continued in silence, the Montana landscape stretching around them. Finally, Sarah asked, "You bought the Miller Ranch?" Matthew nodded. "Looking for a fresh start. Alone?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. A shadow crossed his face. "Yes, ma'am, just me." At Martha's small farmhouse, they were greeted with open arms. Martha fussed over the twins while her husband Daniel helped unload Sarah's belongings. "You'll stay as long as you need," Martha insisted, cradling Emma. "Daniel's sister is coming next month to help with the harvest. She can share the girls' room, and you 3 can keep the spare room." Sarah's throat tightened with gratitude. "I need to find work, Martha. I can't impose." "Actually," Matthew interrupted, "I could use help at my place. The house needs attention before winter, and I'll be busy with the land." He hesitated, then added, "There's a caretaker's cottage. Small, but sound. You and your daughters would have privacy." Martha and Daniel exchanged looks. "That's generous, Mr. Reed," Daniel said slowly. "But a single woman working for a bachelor—" "I would come here each day at dawn," Matthew clarified. "Return at dusk. Mrs. Jenkins could accompany Mrs. Thatcher if propriety demands. I'll pay fair wages." Sarah studied the stranger who had defended her. There was something in his eyes, a sadness perhaps, or understanding that resonated with her own loss. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Thank you." Later, as Matthew prepared to leave, he paused at his horse. "Mrs. Thatcher, whatever you decide, know this: your daughters aren't a burden or a curse. Any fool who thinks girls are worth less than boys doesn't deserve the blessing of children at all." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah wondering what kind of man Matthew Reed really was, and what sorrows he carried beneath his composed exterior. The caretaker's cottage on Matthew Reed's property was indeed small, just 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, but Sarah found herself grateful for the solid roof and clean plank floors. 2 weeks had passed since she'd accepted Matthew's offer, and each day had fallen into a rhythm that brought unexpected comfort to her shattered life. She would wake before dawn to nurse Emma and Elizabeth. Then Martha would arrive by wagon, just as the sun crested the hills. Together, they would work through the main house, a handsome 2-story structure that had stood empty since Miller's death, sweeping out dust, washing windows, and repairing what time and neglect had damaged. Matthew himself was rarely present. During their work, spending daylight hours mending fences, clearing fields, or in town arranging for cattle to be brought in before winter. When their paths did cross, He was unfailingly polite but reserved, asking after the twins with genuine interest but volunteering little about himself. "He's a mystery, that one," Martha remarked one afternoon as they hung freshly laundered curtains. In the parlor, Daniel asked around town. "Seems Mr. Reed sold a successful mine stake in Colorado, but nobody knows why he came to Montana." Sarah smoothed the fabric, admiring how the sunlight filtered through. "Perhaps he wanted a change, like," he said. Martha gave her a knowing look. "Men don't just leave success behind without reason. My guess is heartbreak." "Not everyone shares their sorrows, Martha," Sarah said quietly, thinking of her own carefully guarded grief. "Well, whatever his reasons, he's been fair with you, Martha. Conceited, and decent about the girls." This was true. Matthew had built a small cradle that could be moved from room to room as Sarah worked, and had even fashioned a covered porch swing at the cottage where she could sit with the twins in the evening air. That night, after Martha had departed and the twins were asleep, Sarah sat on that swing, watching as lamps were lit in the main house. Through the window, she could see Matthew at his desk, head bent over papers. The sight stirred something she'd thought deadened by James's death, curiosity about another's inner world. A sudden commotion broke her reverie, hoofbeats approaching fast, followed by shouting. Sarah instinctively rushed inside to check on her daughters, then peered cautiously through the window. 3 riders had entered the yard, their horses lathered from hard riding. Even in the gathering dusk, Sarah recognized Edgar Thorne among them. She watched as Matthew emerged onto his porch, stance wary but composed. "Evening, gentlemen." Matthew's voice carried clearly in the still air. "What brings you out so late?" Edgar dismounted, swaying slightly. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell he'd been drinking. "Came to talk business, Reed." "Business hours ended at sundown," Matthew replied evenly. "I suggest you return tomorrow." Edgar's laugh held no humor. "Heard you're planning to run cattle on this land. Funny thing is, there's limited grazing rights in these parts. Most belong to me now." "I've secured what I need," Matthew said. "See, that's the problem," Edgar continued, moving closer. "You've been buying up grazing contracts from all over the county. Even offered Johnson twice what I did for his north pasture." "Free market," Matthew shrugged. "Nothing stopping you from making a better offer." One of Edgar's companions spoke up. "You're driving up prices for everyone, outsider. That ain't neighborly." "Neither is evicting women and infants," Matthew countered, his tone hardening. "Yet you seemed comfortable with that, Thorne." Edgar's face darkened. "That widow has addled your brain. You're overpaying for everything: land, grazing rights, even labor." He jerked his head toward the cottage. "Paying a woman to clean when any sensible man would have found himself a wife to do it for free." Sarah's cheeks burned at being discussed. "Like property." Through the window, she saw Matthew step forward, his posture shifting subtly. "Mrs. Thatcher is an employee, not a topic for drunk men to discuss," Matthew said, his voice dangerously soft. "Now, state your business clearly, or leave my property." Edgar's hand drifted toward his belt. "Here's my business back off the Johnson contract, or there'll be trouble." The air seemed to still as Matthew regarded Edgar and his companions. When he spoke again, something had changed in his voice, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I don't respond well to threats, Thorne. Never have." He glanced at the other men. "You two might want to consider whether following this fool is worth what could happen next." Something in his tone made the other riders exchange nervous glances. One of them muttered, "Come on, Edgar, we've said our piece." Edgar hesitated, his hand still hovering near his belt. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought he might draw a weapon. Instead, he spat on Matthew's porch steps. "This isn't over, Reed." "For tonight it is," Matthew replied calmly. "Go sleep it off." After they'd ridden away, Sarah watched as Matthew remained on the porch, staring into the darkness long after the sound of hooves had faded. Eventually, he turned toward the cottage, and their eyes met through the window. Sarah didn't look away, acknowledging what they both knew: Edgar Thorne would be back, and next time, words might not be enough. The following morning, Sarah was feeding the twins when a knock came at the cottage door. Matthew stood outside, hat in hand, looking as though he hadn't slept much. "Mrs. Thatcher, I need to apologize for last night's disturbance," he said formally. "There's no need," Sarah replied, adjusting Elizabeth on her breast. "You didn't invite them." Matthew's eyes remained respectfully on her face. "Nevertheless, I'm concerned about your safety. Thorne clearly resents your presence here." "Edgar resented my presence on my own land," Sarah said with unexpected bitterness. "He resents my daughters simply for being born female. His opinion matters little to me now." A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. "You're remarkably steady. For someone who's lost so much, what choice do I have?" Sarah asked simply. "The girls need me strong." Matthew nodded, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'd like to teach you to shoot, if you're willing." The request startled her. "A firearm?" "I have a revolver that would suit your hand. It's prudent, given our remote location and Thorne's temperament." Sarah considered this. James had owned rifles for hunting, but he'd never thought to teach her their use. Like many men, he'd assumed he would always be there to protect his family. "Very well," she agreed, when Martha arrives to watch the girls. For the next week, Sarah spent an hour each afternoon behind the barn with Matthew, learning to handle the Smith & Wesson revolver he'd selected for her. His instruction was patient and thorough, his hands occasionally guiding hers to correct her grip or stance. Each time, Sarah noticed the same thing: his touch was impersonal and brief, yet she found herself increasingly aware of him as a man, not merely an employer. "You're a natural," he remarked on the 7th day as she hit the center of the target. For the 3rd time, "Steady hand, good eye." "My father believed girls should be capable," Sarah explained, carefully lowering the hammer. "He taught me to ride astride when most girls were confined to side saddles." My mother was scandalized. Matthew smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "My sister was the same way. Climbed trees better than I could, insisted on learning to track game." His expression softened with memory. "Drove our parents to distraction." It was the first time he'd mentioned family. Sarah returned the revolver to him, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Where is she now, your sister?" she asked. The smile vanished. "Gone. Influenza took her, her husband, and their son 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding the depth of such loss. Matthew nodded, then surprised her by continuing. "That's why I left Colorado. Too many ghosts." He secured the revolver in its holster. "Rebecca would have liked you. She had the same spark, the kind that doesn't break, even when bent by sorrow." The unexpected compliment warmed Sarah more than it should have. "Your sister sounds like someone I would have been proud to know." As they walked back toward the house, a comfortable silence between them, Sarah realized something had shifted. In sharing his loss, Matthew had opened a door between them, not to romance, which neither was ready for, but to understanding. 2 broken people recognizing in each other the determination to rebuild from ruins. That evening, cradling her sleeping daughters, Sarah allowed herself to consider possibilities she'd previously dismissed as impossible. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a future beyond mere survival. The first snow of winter fell early that year, blanketing the Montana landscape in white silence by mid-October. Sarah woke to find frost patterns on the cottage windows, and both twins unusually fussy. At 4 months old, Emma and Elizabeth had developed distinct personalities, Emma bold and demanding, Elizabeth quieter but more persistent. This morning, however, both were inconsolable. "What's troubling you, my loves?" Sarah murmured, checking for fever. Elizabeth felt warm to the touch, her usually bright eyes glazed and unhappy. Fear gripped Sarah's heart as she bundled both girls against her chest and hurried through the snow toward the main house. Matthew answered her urgent knock immediately, concern etching his features as he ushered them inside to the kitchen's warmth. "Elizabeth is burning with fever," Sarah explained, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. "And Emma seems to be developing the same symptoms." Matthew gently placed his hand on Elizabeth's forehead, his expression grave. "We need to get the doctor from town." "The snow," Sarah began. "I'll go myself," Matthew said firmly. "The stallion can handle the drifts. Mrs. Jenkins was planning to come today, but the weather may delay her. Can you manage until I return with the doctor?" Sarah nodded, though terror clawed at her throat. Childhood illnesses could sweep through families like wildfire, taking the youngest and most vulnerable in days. She had lost 2 young brothers to fever when she was just a girl. "There's willow bark in the pantry," Matthew said, already pulling on his heavy coat. "Make a tea for the fever." And Sarah, he rarely used her given name, the intimacy of it momentarily distracting her from her worry. "They're strong like their mother. Hold on to that." After he left, Sarah settled by the kitchen stove, both babies in her lap. She sang softly as she spooned tiny amounts of willow bark tea into their reluctant mouths, praying with each breath. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Elizabeth's fever seemed to stabilize, but Emma's rose steadily, her small body radiating heat. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. When the kitchen door finally opened, Sarah nearly sobbed with relief, but it was Martha who entered, not Matthew and the doctor. "Daniel insisted on bringing me in the sleigh," Martha explained, rushing to Sarah's side. "Lord have mercy, these poor lambs are burning up." Together, they moved the twins to Matthew's bedroom, where the fire burned brightest. They placed cool compresses on the babies' foreheads and monitored each labored breath. By dusk, with no sign of Matthew or the doctor, Sarah found herself making bargains with God. "Take anything from me," she whispered into Elizabeth's damp curls, "but spare my daughters." Martha, dozing in a chair nearby, didn't hear the desperate prayer. Nor did she see the moment when Sarah finally allowed her tears to fall, not the restrained weeping of a woman maintaining dignity, but the raw sobs of a mother facing her deepest fear. It was in this state that Matthew found her when he finally returned at midnight, the elderly Dr. Wilson following behind him. "The bridge was washed out," Matthew explained, his clothes soaked and freezing. "We had to find another crossing." Dr. Wilson immediately took charge, his gnarled hands gentle as he examined both girls. "Influenza, most likely," he confirmed gravely. "It's moving through the county." "Will they—" Sarah couldn't finish the question. The doctor's kind eyes met hers. "They're young, which works against them, but they appear strong. The next 24 hours will tell." That night became the longest of Sarah's life. Matthew insisted she and Martha take the bedroom with the twins, while he and Daniel kept vigil in the parlor. Every hour, the doctor checked the babies' temperatures and listened to their congested breathing. By dawn, Elizabeth's fever had broken, but Emma's continued to rage. Sarah sat by the bed, one hand on each daughter, as if physically holding them to this world. "You should rest," Matthew said softly from the doorway. Sarah shook her head. "I can't." He entered the room and stood beside her. "I know." After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand on her shoulder. "When Rebecca's boy was sick, she wouldn't leave his side either. Not to eat, not to sleep." Sarah looked up at him. "And he didn't survive." "No," Matthew's voice was raw. "None of them did. I was away on business. By the time I returned, he trailed off, the memory clearly still painful." "Is that why you've been alone? Fear of losing someone else?" Sarah asked quietly. Matthew's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. "Partly, and guilt. I should have been there. You couldn't have known." Neither could you, about your husband's accident, he countered gently. Yet I suspect you carry similar guilt. The observation struck deep. Sarah had indeed tormented herself with thoughts of what she might have done differently, insisted James not go out that day, accompanied him, somehow prevented the fatal fall. We're quite a pair, aren't we? She said with a sad smile. Haunted by what we couldn't change. Perhaps that's why, Matthew began, then stopped himself. Why what? He seemed to choose his words carefully. Why I felt drawn to help you that day. I saw myself in your loss, and something more, the courage to continue despite it. The honesty of his admission created a moment of perfect understanding between them. Sarah realized that in the months since James's death, this was the first time anyone had truly seen her grief without attempting to diminish it with platitudes. Their quiet communion was interrupted by Emma's sudden, desperate coughing. Dr. Wilson hurried in, his expression tightening as he listened to the baby's chest. The congestion is worsening, he said grimly. We need to help clear her lungs. What followed was a night of steam treatments, chest compresses, and desperate prayers. Dawn broke with no improvement, Emma's tiny body fighting for each breath. There's nothing more I can do medically, Dr. Wilson finally admitted. It's in God's hands now. After he left to rest, Sarah held Emma close, willing her own strength into her daughter's failing body. Matthew remained nearby, silent support in the face of potential tragedy. I can't lose her, Sarah whispered. I can't lose either of them. They're all I have left of James, all I have left of the life we planned. Matthew knelt beside her chair. Tell me about him, about James. The request surprised her, but Sarah found comfort in speaking her husband's name, describing his laugh, his dreams for their children, the way he'd sung to her belly each night during her pregnancy. He would have adored them, she concluded, tears streaming unchecked down her face. He would have been so proud of these little girls. He would be proud of you, Matthew said firmly. Of your strength, your determination to give them a good life. As if responding to her mother's voice, Emma stirred, her breathing slightly less labored. By midday, her fever had begun to subside, and by evening, Dr. Wilson pronounced the crisis past. Both should recover fully, he assured them, though you'll need to watch them carefully for the next week. Martha and Daniel returned to their farm with the doctor, leaving Matthew and Sarah alone with the sleeping twins. Exhaustion hit Sarah like a physical blow as the terror of potential loss receded. You should sleep, Matthew said, guiding her to the parlor sofa. I'll watch over them. Too tired to argue, Sarah sank onto the cushions. Before surrendering to sleep, she caught Matthew's hand. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. He squeezed her fingers gently. Get some rest, Sarah. When she woke hours later, disoriented in the darkened room, she found Matthew sitting in a chair nearby, one tiny baby nestled against each broad shoulder. The sight her daughter safely cradled by this man who had become far more than an employer filled her heart with an emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. They woke hungry, he explained softly. I thought you needed sleep more than they needed immediate feeding. Sarah approached, taking Elizabeth from him. You're good with them. They make it easy, he replied, carefully transferring Emma to her other arm. His fingers brushed her shoulders as he ensured both babies were secure in her embrace. They're survivors, like their mother. Standing close in the firelit room, Sarah recognized the moment for what it was, not an ending, but a beginning. The path ahead remained uncertain, with Edgar Thorne's threats still lingering and the harsh Montana winter just beginning. Yet for the first time since James's death, the future held possibility rather than mere endurance. What happens now? She asked quietly. Matthew's eyes, warm in the firelight, held hers steadily. Whatever we decide, Sarah, whatever we decide. As if understanding the significance of the moment, both Emma and Elizabeth stirred, their eyes opening to the world that awaited them. World where their worth would never be questioned, where being female would be celebrated as strength rather than weakness, where they would grow knowing they were treasured beyond measure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land. In pristine white nature's way of offering a clean slate, a fresh beginning for those brave enough to write their own stories upon it.